Imagine this. A decorated German fighter ace with over 170 confirmed victories takes off from the skies over Ukraine. Hours later, his aircraft vanishes. No radio calls, no crash site, no witnesses, just silence. Decades later, historians are still divided. Was he shot down by Soviet fighters? Was it a tragic friendly fire mistake? Or did something else happen that day, something deliberately hidden? Today, we revisit the mysterious disappearance of Heinz Schmidt, a pilot whose fate became one of the Luftwaffe's most enduring mysteries. To understand what happened in 1943, we must first understand the man, not just the myth. You know, when we think about history, we often remember the big moments, the battles, the turning points, the dates we learned in school. But behind every one of those moments stood a human being. Someone who was once a child with dreams. Someone who learned to walk, to read, to wonder about the world. And in the case of Heinz Schmidt, someone who looked up at the sky and felt something most of us can only imagine, a calling. Born on April 20th, 1920, in Bad Homburg, a quiet town in Germany, Heinz came into a world still recovering from the Great War. His family wasn't wealthy. They were working folks, the kind who knew the value of hard work and discipline. But young Heinz had something that money couldn't buy. An obsession. Not with toys or sports, but with flight. Picture a boy, maybe 10 or 11 years old, standing in a field, watching a glider soar overhead. While other kids his age were playing with marbles or chasing each other through the streets, Heinz was sketching aircraft in his notebooks, reading everything he could find about aerodynamics, about lift and drag, about the men who dared to leave the Earth behind. By the time he was a teenager, Heinz had joined the Hitler Youth. Now, I know that carries a lot of weight when we hear it today, but for a young man in Germany in the 1930s, it was often just part of growing up, part of the world he was born into. What mattered to Heinz wasn't politics or ideology, it was the flying. The youth organizations had glider programs, and for the first time he could actually touch the dream that had consumed him. He was good, really good. Instructors noticed immediately that this wasn't just another kid with a passing interest. Heinz had natural instincts in the air, the kind of spatial awareness and reflexes you can't teach. When he banked a glider or judged the wind, it was like watching someone speak a language they were born knowing. So, in 1938, at just 18 years old, Heinz Schmidt made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He enlisted in the Luftwaffe. What began as a childhood fascination would soon turn into one of the most intense combat careers on the Eastern Front. The Luftwaffe in 1938 was expanding rapidly. Germany was rearming, preparing for what everyone feared was coming. Young men like Heinz were funneled into training programs that were rigorous, demanding, and designed to separate the capable from the exceptional. Heinz entered flight school first in Detmold, then in Plauen. These weren't just schools, they were crucibles. The instructors were veterans, men who had flown in the Great War or in Spain. They knew what combat flying demanded, and they didn't coddle their students. You either learned fast or you washed out. Some cadets couldn't handle the physical demands. Others cracked under the pressure. But Heinz thrived. He graduated just as the storm clouds of war were gathering over Europe. And in a stroke of fate, or perhaps destiny, he was assigned to Jagdgeschwader 52. JG 52. If you know anything about Luftwaffe history, you know that name. It would become the most successful fighter wing in the entire war, producing more aces than any other unit in aviation history. Think about that for a moment. Out of all the units he could have joined, Heinz Schmidt landed in the one that would become legendary. Was it luck? Was it because his instructors recognized his skill? we'll never know for certain. But what we do know is this. He was about to be trained by and fly alongside some of the most skilled pilots the world had ever seen. Then came the day that changed everything. September 1939. Germany invaded Poland, and the world went to war. For Heinz, the abstract idea of combat suddenly became very real. But his first taste of battle wouldn't come over Poland. It would come a year later, in the summer of 1940, over the green fields and coastal cliffs of England. The Battle of Britain. You've probably heard about it. The desperate air campaign where the Luftwaffe tried to gain air superiority before a planned invasion. It was brutal, relentless. Day after day, German bombers crossed the Channel with fighter escorts, and day after day the RAF rose to meet them. Heinz Schmidt was there. A young pilot, barely 20 years old, flying a Messerschmitt Bf-109 into a sky filled with flak, tracer rounds, and enemy Spitfires. Imagine being that age, strapping into a cramped cockpit, knowing that in a few hours you might be dead, or worse, shot down over enemy territory, captured, burned. But Heinz didn't just survive, he excelled. Within months of his first combat mission, he had earned the Iron Cross Second Class, then the Iron Cross First Class. These weren't participation medals. You earned those decorations by demonstrating courage, skill, and success in the face of the enemy. And Heinz had all three in abundance. He learned lessons over England that no training school could teach. He learned that combat flying isn't about acrobatics or showmanship. It's about patience, discipline, and seizing the split-second opportunity when it appears. He learned to trust his instincts, to read the battle developing around him, to know when to press an attack and when to break away. Most importantly, he learned how to survive. Because in air combat, that's the first and most essential skill. All the victories in the world mean nothing if you don't make it home. But the real proving ground would not be over England. It would be over the vast, unforgiving skies of the East. June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa. Germany invaded the Soviet Union in the largest military operation in human history. Millions of men poured across the border. Thousands of tanks. And in the skies above them, the Luftwaffe launched wave after wave of aircraft. Heinz Schmidt was part of that enormous aerial armada. JG-52 was sent to the Eastern Front, and from the very first day, the combat was unlike anything he'd experienced over England. The Soviet Air Force had numbers, vast, almost incomprehensible numbers. Their pilots varied wildly in skill, from green rookies who barely knew how to fly in formation, to seasoned veterans who were every bit as dangerous as any RAF pilot. But the Soviet aircraft, in those early days at least, were often obsolete. Biplanes. Outdated bombers with minimal defensive armament. For a skilled pilot in a modern Bf-109, it was what they called a target-rich environment. Heinz began scoring victories almost immediately. 1, then 2, then 5, then 10. Bombers mostly at first, lumbering targets that couldn't outrun or outmaneuver him. But soon enough, he was tangling with Soviet fighters too. Yak-1s, MiG-3s, Lag-3s. Pilots who fought with desperate courage even when outmatched. With each victory, Heinz's confidence grew, but so did his awareness of just how dangerous this theater was. Because the Eastern Front wasn't just about air combat. It was about survival in the most hostile environment imaginable. And then came the day that nearly ended his war before it really began. During a mission deep behind Soviet lines, Heinz's aircraft was hit. The details are murky. Maybe it was ground fire. Maybe a Soviet fighter got a lucky burst in. But suddenly, his engine was trailing smoke. His controls were sluggish, and he knew he wasn't making it back to base. He crash-landed in enemy territory. Think about that. You're a German pilot, alone, behind Russian lines, wearing a Luftwaffe uniform. You know what happens if you're captured. You've heard the stories. Maybe some of them are propaganda, but enough of them are real. For 6 days, Heinz Schmidt evaded capture. 6 days moving at night, hiding during the day, scrounging for food, avoiding patrols. 6 days of fear, exhaustion, and sheer determination. Most pilots who went down behind Soviet lines never made it back. They were captured or killed or simply disappeared into the vast emptiness of the Russian landscape. But Heinz made it. He navigated his way back to German lines, on foot, through enemy territory. When he finally stumbled into a forward position, filthy, hungry, and exhausted, his squadron mates could barely believe it. That experience changed him. You don't go through something like that without it leaving a mark. It hardened him, made him more cautious in some ways, more aggressive in others. And it gave him a reputation. This wasn't just a skilled pilot. This was a survivor. Someone who refused to quit, no matter the odds. By the end of 1941, Heinz Schmidt was already a decorated pilot with multiple kills to his name. He had proven himself in combat over 2 very different theaters. He had survived being shot down behind enemy lines, and he was just getting started. But his reputation truly skyrocketed in the firestorm of Stalingrad, the summer of 1942. The name Stalingrad would soon become synonymous with hell on earth, the brutal urban battle that ground up entire armies. But before the street fighting began, there was an air battle of staggering intensity. The Soviets were determined to hold the city. They poured aircraft into the defense, bombers to strike German positions, fighters to protect them, transport planes to keep the city supplied, and the Luftwaffe was equally determined to gain air superiority, to cut off the city, to support the ground offensive. Heinz Schmidt flew mission after mission over Stalingrad, sometimes 3 or 4 sorties in a single day. Takeoff, combat, land, refuel, rearm, and do it all over again. The pace was exhausting. Pilots fell asleep in their cockpits between missions. Mechanics worked around the clock to keep the aircraft flying. And in the midst of that chaos, Heinz Schmidt became something extraordinary. On one particular day, a day that would be talked about for years afterward, he shot down 7 Soviet aircraft. 7. In one day. There's a term for that in fighter pilot circles. Ace in a day. To become an ace, traditionally, you need 5 victories. Heinz got 7 in one day. Picture what that means. 7 separate engagements. 7 times where you have to position yourself perfectly, lead your target just right, fire at exactly the right moment. 7 times where a split-second mistake means you're the one going down instead. And you have to do all of this while watching for other enemy aircraft, while monitoring your fuel, while keeping track of where you are over the battlefield, while managing the physical and mental exhaustion of high-stress combat. It wasn't just skill. It was something beyond that. It was the kind of performance that separates the merely excellent from the legendary. And the victories kept coming. By the autumn of 1942, Heinz was approaching a milestone that only a handful of pilots in history had ever reached. He was closing in on 100 confirmed aerial victories. Think about that number for a moment. 100. To shoot down 1 enemy aircraft in combat is remarkable. 5 makes you an ace. 10 makes you exceptional. But 100? That's a different category entirely. That's surviving hundreds of combat missions. That's winning 100 individual duels where your opponent was trying just as hard to kill you as you were trying to kill them. When Heinz Schmidt crossed that threshold, his 100th confirmed kill, the recognition came swiftly. He was awarded the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, one of Nazi Germany's highest military decorations. His name was known throughout the Luftwaffe. Other pilots wanted to fly with him, to learn from him. Young cadets heard stories about him during training. He had become what the Germans called an experte, an expert. Not just a skilled pilot, but a master of his craft. His techniques were studied, his tactics were discussed, and his personal score kept climbing. But here's something important to understand, something that gets lost when we just recite numbers and decorations. Heinz Schmidt was still a young man. By early 1943, he was only 22 years old. 22. An age when many people are still figuring out who they are, what they want from life. And he had already lived through more danger, more intensity, more life-and-death moments than most people experience in a lifetime. And the war wasn't finished with him yet. Not by a long shot. Early 1943 brought another close call. During a mission over the Russian lines, Heinz's aircraft was hit again. Once more, he found himself going down behind enemy lines. Once more, he crashed. But this time, he wasn't able to simply walk away. He was injured. The details aren't entirely clear from the records. Possibly wounds from the crash itself. Possibly from the combat that preceded it. But whatever happened, it was serious enough that when he finally made it back to German lines, he needed real medical attention and recovery time. They sent him back to Germany. First to Berlin for treatment, then home to Bad Homburg to recuperate. Can you imagine what that must have been like? After 2 years of near-constant combat on the Eastern Front, suddenly finding yourself back in the quiet town where you grew up. Walking streets that seemed unchanged while you had been transformed entirely? I wonder if he saw childhood friends. I wonder if they asked him what it was like out there, and I wonder what he told them. Because how do you explain that world to someone who's never experienced it? How do you describe what it feels like to have shot down over 100 enemy aircraft, to have been shot down yourself multiple times, to have seen friends and squadron mates die? You probably don't. You probably smile, say you're glad to be home, and keep the real stories locked away somewhere deep inside. But the Luftwaffe needed its aces. By mid-1943, the war had turned. The Germans had been defeated at Stalingrad. The Soviets were pushing back. The vast numerical superiority of Soviet industry was beginning to tell. Every experienced pilot was precious. So in July 1943, Heinz Schmidt returned to the front. But he wasn't returning as just another pilot in the squadron. He was returning as Staffelkapitän, squadron commander, of 6JG-52. Now, he wasn't just responsible for his own survival and success, he was leading men, making decisions that would determine whether they lived or died. Leadership in combat is a peculiar burden. Every commander knows it. You send men into danger. You make tactical decisions with incomplete information. And when someone doesn't come back, you carry that weight. You wonder if a different decision might have saved them. But Heinz was respected. His experience, his skill, his track record, all of it meant that the men under his command trusted him. They knew he wouldn't waste their lives. They knew he understood combat flying at the deepest level. And they knew he led from the front, never asking them to take risks he wouldn't take himself. And then, the front shifted to the skies over Ukraine. The summer of 1943 saw some of the most intense aerial combat of the entire Eastern Front. The Germans were attempting to stabilize their lines after the disaster at Stalingrad. The Soviets were pressing their advantage, launching offensive after offensive. And in the skies above, pilots on both sides fought with desperate intensity. Heinz Schmidt and his squadron were right in the middle of it. The Kuban bridgehead, the battles around Kharkov, the struggle for control of the airspace over the Ukrainian steppe. Day after day, mission after mission, the combat continued. and Heinz kept adding to his score. His 150th victory, his 160th, his 170th, each number representing not just a destroyed aircraft, but a moment where his skill, experience, and perhaps luck kept him alive while his opponent fell. Near Poltava, he scored his 192nd and 173rd victories. 2 more Soviet aircraft falling from the sky, 2 more tallies added to a record that was already extraordinary. His reputation was unmatched, his command was respected. He seemed, to those around him, almost untouchable. But every pilot knows the truth. In combat, no one is untouchable. Skill and experience improve your odds, but they don't make you invincible. All it takes is one lucky shot, one mechanical failure, one moment of bad luck or bad timing. September 5, 1943, a date that would become one of the Luftwaffe's enduring mysteries. Heinz Schmidt took off that morning from his base for another combat mission, the area near Markov in Ukraine. The mission, probably a fighter sweep or bomber escort, though the exact details are lost to history. He was flying his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6, marked as Yellow 7, a newer model of the aircraft that had carried him through hundreds of missions. The morning was probably like countless others he'd experienced. The pre-flight checks, the nervous energy that never quite goes away, no matter how many times you've done this. The weight of the parachute on your back, the smell of aviation fuel and oil, the sound of the engine coughing to life, and then the takeoff, the wheels leaving the ground, the earth falling away below, the formation assembling, heading east toward the front lines, toward whatever the day would bring. But Heinz Schmidt would never land again. Sometime during that mission, in the airspace near Kotelva, Ukraine, Heinz Schmidt and his aircraft vanished. No radio calls indicating trouble, no distress signals, no reports of a crash. No witnesses who could clearly say what happened. He simply disappeared. When the other aircraft from his unit returned to base and Heinz wasn't among them, the concern would have been immediate. Squadron commanders and wingmen kept track of each other. When someone didn't come back, you noticed right away. They waited. Sometimes a pilot would land at a different airfield due to damage or low fuel. Sometimes they'd show up hours later with a story about being forced down and making their way back. But the hours passed, and Heinz Schmidt didn't appear. Search efforts were launched, though how extensive they could be with an active war going on, it's hard to say. They looked for crash sites, they monitored radio frequencies. They checked with other units to see if anyone had seen anything. Nothing. Heinz Schmidt was officially listed as missing in action near Kotelva. His body was never recovered. His aircraft was never found. One of the Luftwaffe's top aces, a man with 173 confirmed victories, had simply vanished from the sky. And from that moment forward, the facts begin to blur into shadows and speculation. History is rarely satisfied with silence. When a famous figure disappears without explanation, people search for answers. They construct theories. They debate possibilities. And in the case of Heinz Schmidt, those debates have continued for more than 80 years. Theory 1, and perhaps the most straightforward. He was shot down by Soviet fighters in air-to-air combat. This would make sense. The Soviets had improved dramatically since the early days of the war. Their pilots were better trained. Their aircraft were better. The Yak-9, the La-5, these were formidable fighters. Even the best ace could be caught by surprise, or simply overwhelmed by numbers. The Soviets often flew in large formations. It's possible that Heinz and his unit encountered a superior force, that in the chaos of combat he was separated and engaged, that someone got a lucky shot. It happens, even to the best. But here's the problem with this theory. The Soviets kept detailed records of their victories, too. They had their own aces, their own propaganda needs. Shooting down a famous German ace would have been celebrated, documented, trumpeted. Yet, there's no clear Soviet claim to match the time and place of Schmidt's disappearance. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. Records get lost, claims go unconfirmed. Chaos is chaos. But it does leave room for doubt. Theory 2 is more uncomfortable. Friendly fire. Specifically, that Heinz Schmidt may have been accidentally shot down by Hungarian forces allied with Germany. This theory emerged later, based on some accounts and circumstantial evidence. The Hungarians were operating in that area. Aircraft identification in the heat of combat was notoriously difficult. Mistakes happened. The Germans themselves occasionally shot down their own aircraft when stressed pilots misidentified a friendly plane as hostile. But here's where it gets interesting. Some historians have suggested that if this was friendly fire, there would have been strong motivation to hide it. Imagine the morale impact. One of your most celebrated aces, killed not by the enemy but by your own allies. That's not something you want widely known. Better to leave it vague. Better to say he's missing in action and let people assume it was enemy action. Was there a cover-up? Was the truth deliberately obscured? We don't know. And perhaps that's exactly the point. Perhaps the ambiguity was intentional. Theory 3 considers mechanical failure or pilot disorientation. The Bf-109, for all its capabilities, had its quirks and problems. Engines could fail, fuel lines could rupture. Combat damage from earlier missions sometimes didn't fully manifest until later. It's possible that Heinz's aircraft simply suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure that gave him no time to radio or bail out. Or perhaps, after so many missions, so many hours of high-stress combat, fatigue finally caught up with him. Pilot disorientation, spatial confusion, a moment of inattention. Any of these could be fatal. You think you're climbing, but you're actually diving. You think you have more altitude than you do, and by the time you realize the mistake, it's too late. Each theory has its proponents. Each has evidence, or at least logic, supporting it, and each reveals as much about the nature of wartime secrecy and record-keeping as it does about Schmidt himself. The truth is, we may never know exactly what happened that day. The sky keeps its secrets well. At the time of his disappearance, Heinz Schmidt had 173 confirmed aerial victories. He was 23 years old. 23? Just stop and think about that. By an age when many of us were still figuring out our careers, he had lived an entire lifetime of intensity, achievement, and danger. He was posthumously promoted to Hauptmann, captain. His name was entered into the rolls of the Luftwaffe's greatest aces. His story was told and retold among veterans. But unlike many of his fellow pilots, Heinz Schmidt has no grave. There's no place where family could visit, where flowers could be laid, where the ritual of remembrance could be performed. There are only records. Combat reports. Photographs showing a young man with a slight smile. Documentation of missions and victories, and the endless debates among historians about what really happened that September day. In a way, his disappearance made him even more legendary. Humans are drawn to mysteries. We're unsatisfied by unanswered questions. And so Heinz Schmidt's name lingered in a way that other aces, whose fates were known, perhaps didn't, but maybe that's appropriate. Because Schmidt's story is more than just a military record. It's more than just a list of victories and decorations. It's a reminder of how many lives, even those of the most celebrated, ended without closure. Think about all the families during that war who received telegrams saying their loved one was missing. Not dead, not captured, missing. That word that offers neither certainty nor relief. just an aching absence and questions that might never be answered. Heinz Schmidt's mother and father, his friends, his squadron mates, they all had to live with that ambiguity. No body to bury, no clear explanation to provide closure. Just the knowledge that he took off one morning and never came back. And in that sense, his story represents millions of others. The missing, the disappeared. The ones who vanished into the chaos of war and left behind only questions. The mystery isn't just about how he died, but why the truth was never fully uncovered. Was it wartime secrecy, lost records, deliberate obscuring of an embarrassing incident, or simply the fog of war, the reality that in the chaos of combat, not everything gets documented, not every loss gets explained? To this day, historians continue to debate, not out of morbid curiosity, but out of respect for the past. Because every unanswered question is a person whose story deserves to be told. Every mystery is a life that mattered, that left a mark, that shouldn't be forgotten just because the ending is unclear. Sometimes history gives us clear answers. Other times, it leaves us with whispers, fragments, and mysteries that refuse to fade. The disappearance of Heinz Schmidt remains one of those unresolved wartime enigmas, a story that connects duty, legend, and the silence of a single vanished flight. A young man who dreamed of flying became one of the most skilled pilots of his generation, only to vanish into the same sky that had called to him since childhood. We remember him not despite the mystery, but perhaps because of it. Because his story reminds us that history isn't just about the clear narratives, the decisive moments, the questions with easy answers. It's also about the shadows, the silences, the stories that remain incomplete. And maybe that's the most human thing about history. It's messy, it's uncertain. It leaves us wondering. If this story moved you, leave a comment sharing your thoughts on what you believe happened that day. Like this video, subscribe, and join us as we uncover more untold stories that shaped the course of history.